In this tutorial, we're going to talk about inverses, contrapositives, and indirect reasoning. Let's take a look at some vocabulary first. So the first thing that we want to look at is what the word negation means. And we are very familiar with the word negative, and negative just means the opposite of something. So when we write the negation of a statement, it's a statement with the opposite truth value. So, for example, let's take a look at the statement, Austin is the capital of Texas. Now, this has a true truth value. So if I wanted to make the negation of this, I would say, Austin is not the capital of Texas. And this is a false statement. So a negation is just a statement that has the opposite truth value. So another vocabulary word that we have in a new concept is called the inverse. And what the inverse does is it negates the hypothesis and conclusion of a conditional statement. So we're back into the conditional statement type of ideas. And if you'll recall, we had converses before, as well as biconditionals. Well, here we're going to add a new one. We have an inverse. Let's take a look at an example. So here's our conditional statement. If you live in Texas, then the capital is Austin. So if I were to make the inverse of this statement, I'm going to take the hypothesis and negate that. So that would be if you do not live in Texas. And then we have to negate the conclusion. Then the capital is Austin. Well, the negation of that would be then the capital is not Austin, which gives the entire inverse being, if you do not live in Texas, then the capital is not Austin. So that's our inverse. So here we have the contrapositive. So what the contrapositive does is it switches the hypothesis and the conclusion and then negates them both. So let's take a look at the conditional statement that we just looked at. So here we are again. If you live in Texas, then the capital is Austin. So first of all, let's go ahead and switch the hypothesis and the conclusion. So here we go. If the capital is Austin, then you live in Texas. So there we go. I switched the hypothesis and the conclusion. Now I need to negate both the hypothesis and the conclusion. So this is going to look like this. If the hypothesis states if the capital is Austin, then to negate it, it would be if the capital is not Austin. So if the capital is not Austin, now let's negate the conclusion. Then you live in Texas. Well, the negation of that would be then you do not live in Texas. Then you live in Texas. And there's my contrapositive statement. And what's interesting about the contrapositive statement is it has the same exact truth value as the original conditional statement. So if you live in Texas, then the capital is Austin. That's a true statement. If we look at the contrapositive, it should also be true. If the capital is not Austin, then you do not live in Texas. And if we're talking relative to the United States, that is also a true statement. And this is always going to happen. The conditional statement, CS, will always be equal to the truth value of the contrapositive. Now, let's go ahead and summarize all the different kinds of conditional statements that we've seen so far. So to sum up, the very first kind of statement that we saw was a conditional statement. And we read this, P, then Q. And the way that we read these statements is it says, if P, then Q. All right. The next kind of statement that we looked at was the converse. And what a converse did is it switched these statements around. So it said, if Q, then P. If Q, then P. The third kind of statement that we looked at was called a biconditional, which said P, then Q, which we read P if and only if Q. And now our new one, inverse, well, it does this negation thing, right? So what the inverse is going to look like is the hypothesis and the conclusion are in the same place, except we're negating them. Well, we use the squiggle that's on top of our congruent symbol to say not. So not P, then not Q. So we read this, if not P, then not Q. So the squiggles mean not. And then the last one that we have is the contrapositive, which switches the hypothesis and the conclusion and negates them both. So this would be not Q, then not P. If not Q, then not P. So that's a great little summary for you guys to follow. And that concludes this tutorial.